Good morning, everyone. Lisa Senecal here from Lincoln Square, and I am really happy to be joined by David Noll. David, welcome.
Great to be back.
Folks, David is a professor of law and associate dean for faculty research at Rutgers. He's had commentary sort of everywhere, like the New York Times, Politico, Slate, and he's also the co-author of Vigilante Nation: How State-Sponsored Terror Threatens Our Democracy. This came out obviously before the re-election of Donald Trump, but it becomes more and more relevant, unfortunately, every day, and is still essential reading. So I strongly encourage everybody to pick up a copy of the book, or get the digital version and read it, because it's really important work that you and your co-author have done. David, can you, just for folks who are not deep into what really state-sponsored vigilantes are, can you give us some background on that?
Yeah, so thanks so much. So this is a book that came out last fall. And when people think about vigilantes, they tend to think about sort of lone wolves or militia groups that are, maybe off in, Oregon or Idaho or somewhere like that, operating on their own. And what John Michaels and I argue in the book is that when you look at American history, that's not actually the style of vigilantism that we should be most concerned about. And we went all the way back to the Fugitive Slave Acts and then brought the story forward to MAGA politics. And our thesis was that state-supported vigilantism, even though it kind of sounds like an oxymoron, right? You say, how could vigilantes be supported by the state? But state-supported vigilantism is really the thing to worry about, because you have vigilantes that are operating with the backing of either a political party or the government. And then really sort of the meat of the book is looking at stuff that happened during the Biden administration, where you had state legislatures taking measures to empower vigilantes and encourage them to enforce the MAGA agenda in their communities. And so in our view, that's really sort of an important part of the story of how Trump returned to power, is that even though the federal government was not supporting MAGA policies while Biden is in office, you had all these states, you had Florida, Tennessee, Texas, state legislatures and state executives were sending a message to these very aggressive, very militant vigilantes that they wanted them enforcing the MAGA agenda. So that's the book, and now we're here.
And now we're here. So we're seeing more of this now, obviously, because it's empowered by the second Trump administration and sort of the whole of the federal government, or at least his cabinet and other sycophants. How do you see this playing out in real time? And I definitely want to get into talking about the defiance of court orders and how that is an element of what's happening now.
Yeah, for sure. So this sort of the encouragement of vigilantism was happening in state houses and in the states prior to the second Trump administration. And when Trump takes office again, all of a sudden you have all of these strategies that have been perfected at the state level, and they are being implemented in executive orders that are coming out of the White House. So, I've mentioned Christian nationalism, this idea that the United States is a Christian nation. And we're not talking about sort of, like a Sunday school soft version of Christianity here, right?
This is others is
an extreme, fundamentalist. Men should be in charge of society. People who seek abortions and healthcare providers should be imprisoned. The power of the state should be used to indoctrinate people in fundamentalist Christianity. This is the sort of cluster of ideas that I'm talking about. But, one of the most important figures in the second Trump administration is the director of the Office of Management and Budget, a guy named Russell Vought. who doesn't appear in the headlines so much, but he's really one of the key players behind this, this glut of executive orders that are coming out of the White House. And one of the things that's really important for people to appreciate is that even though Republicans have a lock on federal government, right? They have Congress, they have the House, they have the Senate, they have the executive branch, and the Supreme Court is controlled by Republican appointees who have, really just these crazy ideas about executive power. Going through the proper channels and doing things through law is not something that the administration is interested in doing. And so they're putting out all of these executive orders, and a big piece of those orders is to encourage this kind of sort of really aggressive enforcement of the Christian nationalist agenda. I'll give you just one example of sort of how pernicious this is. Right at the beginning of the Trump administration, there was an executive order that purported to bar federal contractors from using DEI programs. And, some of these programs are, completely inoffensive. There's trainings that we've all been to that say, don't be racist at work, and, be careful how you talk to people, and don't sexually harass people in the workplace. And there's really no, question that they violate federal law. But what the executive order said is that we're going to treat companies that continue to maintain DEI programs as breaching federal contracting guidelines. And then it did something really, sort of, I don't want to say clever, but really sort of, genius in its evil, is that if you falsely certify that you don't have one of these programs, we're going to treat that as a violation of a law called the False Claims Act, which is this old Civil War era statute, which allows private parties to bring these crippling lawsuits against federal contractors. And so it kind of set up a liability trap for companies that have these programs. And the lawyers know what's going on. The lawyers can read this and say, yikes, right? All of a sudden, there's going to be DEI whistleblowers who are maybe bringing False Claims Act lawsuits against our companies, maybe snitching on us to various parts of the executive branch. And it's very much of a piece with the efforts at the state law that we saw to encourage people to snitch on each other and to police their communities and to engage in this broad range of vigilante behaviors.
Right, and it ties in with what Pam Bondi is doing with the VA, and basically asking people to report on their coworkers if they see any examples of anti-Christian bias, which is a wildly overly broad term that pretty much anything that offends anyone who is Christian, including like someone telling you that they don't want to get preached at in the break room and attempted to be saved, is an anti-Christian bias, and you can be reported and fired for that. So it's sort of pervasive at this point. And I'm glad you talked about the Supreme Court and sort of the ideology that's really influencing what's happening there, and what Russell Vogt is doing, because he is the architect, or one of the main architects behind Project 2025. And that is being implemented at breakneck speed in this first 100 days of the Trump administration. How do you see these continued pushbacks against the court tying into the goals of Project 2025 and the seeming complete willingness of the Trump administration to either find wiggle room around pretty clear court orders or just flat out defy them?
Well, I think what the administration realizes is that one of the most powerful tools available to the president and the White House is the ability to do things unilaterally. So normally, right, when you want to pass a law, you have to go through Congress, right? There's lots of debate, lots of people are involved in the legislative process who can block legislation or ask for changes. And it, sort of in our system, right, one of the most important powers the president has is just to do stuff. And people, they should understand that, when the president does something, maybe there was a lawyer in the White House who looked at it, although, right, the office of White House counsel has been captured by these extreme MAGA figures who are not really examining what's going on for legality, or they're taking these extreme legal positions about what the president can do. And so, right, the president can put out these orders and direct agencies, whether it's DHS or HHS or what have you, to do things. And you might say, well, okay, well, if those are illegal, what difference does it make? Because the courts will eventually come along and issue an order that says, no, you've got the law wrong. You can't do that. And part of the logic from the president's perspective is that the president can shift facts on the ground, regardless of illegality. And there's no better example of this than the rendition flights to El Salvador that purported to invoke the Alien Enemies Act. Those were sort of looking at Judge Boasberg's fact-finding in the order that he put out, finding that the government was likely in criminal contempt. Those were deliberately calculated to avoid the possibility of people who are subject to these orders going to the courts and seeking really just any due process to ascertain whether they're members of these gangs that they're allegedly part of. And because the administration was able to create facts on the ground and move quickly and hide what they were doing from the courts, now we're in this incredibly difficult situation where you have 200 odd men trapped in El Salvador, many of whom we know from reporting, have no connections to Venezuelan gangs or have extremely sketchy connections. And yet, because they're in the custody of a foreign country, the U.S. courts, can't just issue an order and that says return them back, right? The U.S. courts have to navigate the fact that under the Constitution, the president is in charge of foreign affairs. And so that's just one example, but there's sort of, it's not simply move fast and break things, it's move fast in order to change the status quo and in order to create facts on the ground. And that's why, we just got out of the 100-day period. That's why they keep pushing. That's why they keep issuing these orders, even in the face of court rulings. You think about the law firm rulings. Right now, multiple courts have said, yeah, you can't deny access to federal buildings to a law firm because they employed a lawyer that personally irks Trump. But they keep pushing out the orders because they know that creates facts on the ground and that everybody else has to play catch up. And that, sort of really our remedies for this kind of unconstitutional behavior are slower than the executive's ability to act.
So we do have to act, right? The judicial system is attempting to hold to account somebody when they issue these rulings, and the judge who issued the order attempting to stop or turn around the flights that were on their way to El Salvador with these men who you're talking about, and that was completely ignored. He hasn't stopped. He has stated that if the order doesn't end up being complied with, he does have additional steps that he can take, even beyond instructing U.S. Marshals to take someone into custody for contempt. So can you explain to us first of all, who is that person that the contempt order is against? Because they're not going to go grab Trump and take him into custody. So who is that against, and what's the process if even the U.S. Marshals are refusing to carry out their responsibilities under a court order?
Yeah. So let me break down the process and do a little law professor stuff here, because the law of contempt is wonky, and there's some very important distinctions in it that folks should be aware of that affect how proceedings are going to play out. So the most important thing to keep in mind is that there's a difference between what's called a criminal contempt and a civil contempt. And a criminal contempt proceeding, which Judge Boasberg is at the beginning stages of, it's like a criminal prosecution. The idea is that somebody has defied the court, and that needs to be punished in order to preserve the court's authority. So criminal contempts, generally, lawyers are terrified of them. You would never, like want even a suggestion that a judge is going to hold you in criminal contempt. They are subject to the president's pardon power. So that's sort of hanging above everything that Judge Boasberg is doing. The reason that he's pursuing a criminal contempt is that the Supreme Court has said that the case that was brought before him was in the wrong venue. It actually belonged in Texas. And when you're just looking backwards, when you're doing a backward-looking proceeding, only criminal contempt is available to a judge. So the other kind of contempt is what's known as civil contempt. And folks might have seen stories of, sort of journalists who are held in a holding cell because they refuse to disclose a source, or sometimes you'll see cases where people are hiding money from the courts, and the court will say, sign over a deed to the vacation house, to your ex, or something like that. And it's like, no, I'm not going to comply with the court's orders, right? So the court's, usual response, sort of, they're sort of like, like going through, a series of escalations and all of these. Of course, they I really mean it this time. Then they impose fines, and they try and do other things to get you to comply. But the end of the civil contempt process is that somebody is arrested and held in a jail cell until they comply with the court's order. And there's a couple interesting things about civil contempt. One is that civil contempt confinement can last indefinitely, because somebody can be held in jail until they comply with the court's order. And the second piece of it is that under very long-standing precedent, civil contempts, because they're designed to induce compliance with the court's authority, cannot be pardoned. They're not treated as a crime. So what's going on now, right? So everybody's talking about contempt because in sort of the El Salvador cases, and I should mention sort of in other areas, there's been, fairly apparent defiance of the court's orders. Judge Boasberg has to go the criminal route, right? Because he doesn't have a live case in front of him anymore, right? He can't hold somebody to compel compliance with his order, because when his case went up to the Supreme Court said, no, that should have been filed in Texas. So what he's doing is, sort of really using the opportunity to publicize what's going on, just to make sure that people are paying attention to this. I really recommend that people read the probable cause order that he put out, because it walks through very patiently. The government was on the phone. I entered this order, right? The government, Drew Ensign, right, was given an opportunity to consult with his clients. They did not comply. And it's really just sort of an outrageous, sequence of events where he says, look, I gave them a chance to comply. I told them that this was the order. And again, right, this is all directed at making sure that people have just the most basic level of due process. And the conclusion of his order is that he finds probable cause that the government is in criminal contempt. Now, Lisa, going back to what you were saying, there's reporting that Stephen Miller and Kristi Noem were the main decision makers within the White House, but that's not a fact that has been established for the court. And there's a difference between, there's a difference between what you read in Axios and what's admissible as a fact in a legal proceeding. And the court is, if the court's going to hold somebody in contempt, needs to make a record of the contempt. So what Judge Boasberg did is really interesting. He said, look, you guys seem to be in contempt. I'm going to give you an opportunity to purge the contempt. So, even after they have given him the middle finger, and right, even now that we know how just incredibly unpopular and right it is for the government to engage in these sort of unconstitutional actions, the judge is giving them an off-ramp and saying, look, you sent these migrants to El Salvador without any semblance of process. The Supreme Court has said 9-0, right? Clarence Thomas has said that that you
And
need
then
to
when
provide due
he's on the
process.
same side as right, like it's indisputable.
Yeah, I mean, you have, the most insurrection friendly justices saying, hold up, guys, here, like we need a little bit more due process before we do this. And Boasberg, this guy, he has, Solomonic patience and wisdom. He's saying, right, even now, right, I'm giving you the opportunity to purge the contempt. So the first thing he said is, right, I'd like to hear from the government how they intend to purge the contempt. We don't have a response yet from the government because the DC Circuit paused his order and is taking a look at it. But then he said, okay, if you're not going to purge the contempt, then I am ordering you to disclose who was involved in these decisions. And he said, you've attempted to shield that from the court by invoking the state secrets privilege. And he says, among other things, the fact that you're tweeting about it and, talking to any number of reporters belies the argument that this is actually a state secret. So he rejects the invocation of the state secrets privilege. So the next step is, it's sort of up to the government, right? Will the government take good faith measures to comply with the court's order and purge the contempt, or will it disclose who's involved in the decision to ignore the court's orders? And then, right, if the government doesn't comply with either of those orders, we can talk about more coercive things that the court can do.
Yeah, because it seems pretty unlikely that they're going to comply with either of those things unless public sentiment is starting to be so against them in these actions that they're taking, ignoring due process and disappearing people into torture compounds. Getting these people back. What are the legal remedies related to the taxpayer dollars that are being spent to fund this? I don't even want to call it incarceration because it's so much worse than that. That people, many of whom were legally in the United States, have been disappeared and into a black site, basically. So, are there legal steps that can be taken? Are there actions that can be filed against the federal government for using our taxpayer dollars to pay the president of El Salvador to run this black site where due process is being ignored so he can make money?
Yeah, so sort of taxpayer lawsuits are tricky. They're not easy to do, and there's a lot of legal obstacles to them succeeding. Sort of in an ordinary world, we would look to Congress to do oversight about how the executive is spending tax dollars. Congress right now is abdicating its constitutional responsibilities because the White House has, made a lot of noises about how it's not required to follow appropriations laws, and the president is claiming again through Vought, sort of this unconstitutional power to disregard Congress's power of the purse, which is one of the most fundamental powers that Congress has under Article 1 of the Constitution. But that's not to say that there's nothing the courts can do and that lawyers can do to put pressure on the administration. And I talked about Judge Boasberg's case, but people should be aware there's also proceedings in front of Judge Zinnes, right, in the District of Maryland, and she has a live case, and civil contempt is a possibility in that case. And remember, civil contempt is not subject to the president's pardon power. So what happened in her case is the Supreme Court, said, 9-0 that the government was required to, quote unquote, facilitate the release of Mr. Abrego Garcia from custody in El Salvador. And the government has essentially stonewalled or slow walked in response to that unanimous Supreme Court order. And so, she did, what can a judge do? Well, one of the things a judge can do is force facts out into the open. And so she put in place a really aggressive schedule where lawyers from the ACLU were authorized to depose government officials and to get all the internal documents. For reasons that we don't really know, that was paused for a week with the consent of the ACLU. And people don't really know what's going on behind the scenes there. There was, people on social media were saying, well, maybe this indicates that there is a compromise solution in the works. That's unclear. Right, the stay of discovery ended, I want to say yesterday or today, and so unless there's some breakthrough in the case, that's going to resume. What we're going to see is a lot more defiance and a lot more disregard for the court's orders, and at that point, things are going to start getting very hot in her courtroom because assuming that DOJ lawyers continue to stonewall and to defy the orders to provide information that the court is demanding, we're going to start by seeing potentially sanctions imposed on the lawyers, right? Lawyers have a duty of candor towards the court. And people sometimes say, like none of this makes a difference because court orders are enforced by the court. That's not true, right? You go to law school, right? You spend, 20 years of your life building a legal practice. Your livelihood depends on your ability to stand up in court and make arguments to the court and represent clients. And if you are, if you're someone like Drew Ensign and the court is saying, if you don't disclose accurate information, you're going to be subject to discipline, right? Your license to practice law is at risk. That's a pretty powerful motivator to supply the information that the court is looking for. So I think that, despite some of the doomerism that you see out there, the court does have very powerful tools to force information about what's going on. And of course, DOJ will appeal that. The Fourth Circuit has lost its patience with, the DOJ's frivolous appeals. And, you have that incredible opinion from Judge Wilkerson saying, essentially, guys, like things are about to get really bad. It's not too late to start respecting the rule of law. But the first things that's going to happen is that, right, we're going to get disclosure more than we currently have about who was actually involved in these decisions. And then that takes us into the civil contempt process, where you're going to see, formal contempt findings, potentially fines imposed against officials at state and DHS who are involved in these decisions. And by the way, those don't depend on the executive branch to be enforced, right? If a court enters a judgment, that there's $1,000 fine every day or a $10,000 fine every day. There's no executive branch involvement in that. That's a court order. Credit bureaus pick it up. The plaintiffs could potentially enforce that judgment. So we're potentially looking at a situation where legal representatives are seizing assets or real estate. And then, right, that all leads up to, right, if all of those opportunities to comply with aren't respected, that leads up to a situation where the court is ultimately ordering the arrest of a contender.
So we can follow these cases. We can make sure that we're raising the alarms and spreading this information. But on a day-to-day basis, for all the people who are watching here today, what as citizens can we be doing that increases the pressure on the legal community and on throughout the judicial system, because judges they live in the world, right? So
Yeah.
they're not immune to understanding what public sentiment is and what the American people want. So what would you like to see the American people doing in response to the illegality that's going on?
Well, let me start with lawyers because they're very near and dear to my heart. There's rallies happening at courthouses every day today, where lawyers are being encouraged to wear suits and to bring a pocket constitution. And it seems kind of trite, that you have lawyers showing up in courts and saying, "Yeah, we respect the rule of law, we respect court orders." But as you say, this is a political battle, and it's a battle for public opinion. And lawyers, oftentimes don't agree about a lot of things. We're hired because people get in fights, and they have very strongly held positions, and you work on any big case, you end up convinced that you're right and the other side is, is full of it. And to have the legal community coming together to say, this will not stand, right? We need to respect the rule of law. That I think is a very powerful thing. I think, sort of leaders of large law firms who are tempted to cave to the Trump administration really need to realize that they're on the wrong side of this issue. And, I understand there's risks about partners leaving and taking books of business with them. I think if law firm leaders are looking at it from that perspective, their focus is way too narrow and they're not really appreciating the risks that their firms are facing. And I think if you talk to people who have studied the decline of democracies, they will tell you that cutting deals in the long term with a corrupt administration, everyone talks about Lando Calrissian, but that's, I guess it's our go-to way of analyzing this, right? You end up in the position of Lando Calrissian. And then, another important thing, especially for people who are represented by Republicans in the Senate or the House, is to get in touch with your members of Congress. Again, I know it sounds trite. I know that, sort of anyone who's been involved in politics or, just, as a citizen in our democracy, over the past years, has been told countless times that people in Congress hearing from you makes a difference. But this is an issue on which it's absolutely true that, social scientists who have studied respect for court orders and, sort of the breakdown of the legal system, one of the primary determinants of whether court orders is respected is whether there is elite support for the courts. And right, when they say elite, they mean, powerful political figures, powerful media figures. And so, people really need to be talking to members of Congress and saying, hey, you guys generally really care about the courts, and you've invested a huge amount of energy and resources in shaping the courts to do what you want and to reflect your judicial philosophy. Are you really going to throw it all away and say that compliance with court orders is optional? Because the next time control of the White House changes, whatever precedent is established in this administration is going to be applicable to the next Democratic president. And if a Democratic president is saying that all student loans are going to be canceled or that ICE is abolished or whatever have you, do you really want a president to be the last word on that, and for the White House to take the position that a court order is just a piece of paper as to which compliance is totally optional? So, I think people, I say this, particularly to people who disagree with me about, the most fundamental issues, I think they really need to be thinking about where it takes us if we go into a world where you're not following court orders. Because, we can have a discussion about, how far courts should go and whether they're interfering with legitimate executive functions. But a world where people can be picked up off the street and, swept away, to El Salvador or whatever country Marco Rubio signs a deal with is a terrifying place to be in. And it compromises MAGA values, conservative values. You don't have to be on my side of the aisle to be extremely worried about these threats to the rule of law.
Yeah, I appreciate the putting pressure on members of Congress. I would encourage people, even if you have Democrats who are representing you in the House or Senate, put pressure on them as well to be speaking up about this, because there's a real battle going on inside the Democratic Party right now about whether or not they should continue to be raising the issue of Abrego Garcia being disappeared into CCOT. And the idea that we need the perfect poster child to be supporting in order to defend due process is a really dangerous place for us to be, because what the administration's already saying, I listened to another interview this morning with a person from the Justice Department saying, well, we're allowed to to use these special emergency powers because these people are members of MS-13. And if they're members of MS-13, then we don't have to afford them due process, right? But then when you get to prove that you're actually not a member of MS-13, like that's it is this revolving door of arguments that don't make any sense, and there's no way to get out of the trap that they put you in. So everybody contact all the members of Congress and put pressure on them, on this issue and so many others, to step up and speak out and defend the rule of law and democracy and the type of country we all want to be living in the future. David, I want to give you the last word.
Well, I know we're almost out of time, but I just really want to underscore for folks how un-American this idea that you have to be perfect to be entitled to due process is, right? The reason our laws can do terrible things to people. You can be deported, you can be imprisoned, you can be put to death. There's extremely powerful penalties available under the law. The reason we have due process is because we want some assurance other than a random government agent's say so that those penalties are warranted. And if you are in a world where due process is only available to people who are perfect, or who the government says is perfect, then you're really giving up on the idea of government under the rule of law, because that determination by, it could be an ICE agent, right? It could be Stephen Miller, right? That you are not a real citizen, or you're like they could say, I'm a gang member, right? And say, oh, because of that, right, you're not entitled to any due process. You read the Declaration of Independence, that's what it's talking about, right? This is something we've seen before. And we know where this leads. And that's why, right, due process is one of the most fundamental principles in our Constitution, right? One that goes all the way back really to before the Constitution was adopted. And so, right, people should, don't be misled by the idea that, oh, these are bad guys and they're not entitled to any process. If you buy into that, you're saying that nobody is entitled to due process.
Thank you, David. Oh, you have a piece coming out next week, or in the next couple of weeks. Where can we?
So on the contempt of court stuff, I've got a piece up now at Democracy Docket, which I think the title is "If the Marshals Go Rogue, the Courts Have Other Options Available to Them." I've got an academic piece which will be coming out later in May. I'm not exactly sure which outlet it will be in, but I'll send a link. We can post it. We can circulate it. Keep an eye out for that. That'll go into a lot more detail about the powers that courts have available to them, and some of the things that lawyers can do to make sure that court orders are respected.
Great. We'll make sure that we push that out when it's available, and everybody go to Democracy Docket and subscribe to them as well. That's really important information that Mark Elias and his organization are putting out all the time. Thank you again, David, for being here. We really can't thank you enough for the work that you're doing. It's essential, and we appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us.